Welcome back, deep divers. Today we are going to dive deep into Australian migration.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. And to help us navigate all the twists and turns, we've got an SBS News article hot off the press, January 1st, 2025, titled, From Skilled Visas to Ballots, How Australia's Migration Changes Could Unfold in 2025.
Oh, wow. So this is really fresh right at the start of the new year.
Yeah, and they're predicting all sorts of shakeups, especially with an election coming up. But first things first, the article talks about Australia trying to move away from permanent temporariness. Have you ever heard that term?
Not exactly, but I can kind of guess what it means.
It's like, imagine always being on a tourist visa, never quite able to settle down, always wondering if you'll have to pack your bags and leave.
Yeah, that must be so stressful, never knowing if you can build a life somewhere.
Right. The article says that's the reality for a lot of people in Australia, stuck in this cycle of temporary visas.
Makes sense. Australia's always been a popular destination, but I guess the system hasn't always made it easy for people to put down roots.
And that can create a whole host of problems. Like, for example, it makes people more vulnerable to exploitation.
Oh, yeah, totally. If your right to be in the country is always up in the air, you're in a weaker position to, stand up for yourself.
Exactly. And it's not just individuals who are affected. The government can't really plan for the future if they don't know who's going to be here, what skills they'll have.
It'd be like trying to build a house on, quicksand or something. Nothing stable.
Perfect analogy. So it sounds like these 2024 changes are all about creating a more stable foundation.
Yeah, I think that's the goal, moving away from this temporary revolving door and towards a system that encourages people to, actually become Australians.
Which is a perfect segue into the nitty-gritty of those changes. The SBS article dives into a whole bunch of visa updates, student visas, skilled visas, even visa ballots, which is a whole other can of worms.
Oh, wow. Lots to unpack there. It sounds like they're really shaking things up. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with student visas. Always a hot topic. The article mentioned that the government wanted to cap international student enrollments, but ultimately abandoned the plan. Do you know what happened there?
I do, actually. It was quite a political battle.
Uh-oh. Sounds juicy. Fill me in.
So the government's initial idea was to cap international student enrollments at 270,000 for 2025.
Wow, that's a big number. Why did they want to put a cap on it?
Well, they cited a few concerns like too much strain on infrastructure, housing, transportation, that kind of thing. And they also wanted to make sure the quality of education didn't suffer with too many students.
Makes sense. But obviously the cap didn't happen, so what did they do instead?
They came up with this new system. Instead of a hard cap, they've got these high priority and standard priority processing categories for student visas.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what does that mean in practice?
So basically, every education provider is guaranteed high priority processing for up to 80% of their allocated student intake.
So the first 80% get fast-tracked?
Yeah, pretty much. But once they hit that 80% mark, any further applications go into the standard priority category.
Which probably means a much longer wait.
Exactly. So it's a way to manage the flow without an outright cap.
Smart. So even though the hard cap didn't fly, they're still trying to keep things under control.
Yeah, trying to strike that balance between attracting international students and making sure things don't get out of hand.
Speaking of balancing acts, let's move on to what happens after graduation. The article talked about some pretty big changes to the temporary graduate visa, too.
Oh, yeah. Big changes, especially the new age limit. That's been causing quite a stir.
Right. The age limit. Before we get into that, can I just say I was pretty surprised to hear about that.
Yeah, it's a big shift.
I always thought, if you've got the skills and qualifications, age shouldn't be a barrier. But apparently, Australia's got other ideas.
It seems that way. So before, temporary graduate visa holders could stay in Australia for 2 to 4 years after graduating, depending on their qualifications.
Right, pre-standard stuff. But now...
No. Not only have they shortened that to a maximum of 2 years for a bachelor's degree, 2 years for a master's by coursework, and 3 years for a master's by research or a PhD.
Okay, so a bit shorter, but not drastically different.
But there's the kicker, the age limit of 35.
Wow, that's way younger than I expected. So let me get this straight. If you're over 35... and you decide to, do a master's degree in Australia, you might not be able to stay afterwards.
It definitely makes it harder, yeah.
That seems kind of unfair, doesn't it? What if you've got years of experience in your field? Wouldn't that be valuable to Australia?
That's one of the big criticisms, yeah.
So what's the reasoning behind this age limit?
Well, the government says it's about encouraging genuine temporary stays, whatever that means.
Vague much.
Right. And they also talk about prioritizing pathways to permanent residency for younger graduates. Like, they think younger grads are more likely to, I don't know, put down roots and stay in Australia long term.
But that doesn't take into account people who might want to move to Australia later in life, right?
Exactly. And it ignores the fact that older graduates often bring a lot of experience and specialized knowledge.
Like, imagine someone in their 40s with, say, 20 years of experience in a field like engineering. Wouldn't they be an asset?
You'd think so, but this new system doesn't seem too keen on them.
It's like they're trying to create a younger Australia. But that could really backfire, couldn't it? Like, what about all those sectors that rely on experience?
Oh, absolutely. Think about healthcare, for example. You can't just fast-track experience in a field like nursing.
And Australia has always relied on skilled migrants to fill those roles.
Exactly. So this age limit could actually create shortages in certain sectors.
It's like they're solving one problem and creating another in the process.
That's a good way to put it. It's definitely a bit of a head-scratcher.
Okay, so we've talked about student visas and what happens after graduation. But the article also mentioned a whole new system for skilled visas. The Skills in Demand visa, or SID visa.
Yes, the SID visa. It's kind of a big deal for anyone thinking about skilled migration to Australia.
So tell me, what's so different about this SID visa? How does it address this whole permanent temporariness issue we've been talking about?
Well, one of the big changes is the focus on attracting highly skilled workers. They've basically got a points system now.
Points system. Sounds familiar.
It is. And you get points based on your skills, qualifications, work experience, English language proficiency. The higher your score, the better your chances of getting a visa.
So it's like a game. You got to rack up the points to win.
Pretty much. And to make it even more targeted, they've got different income thresholds for each stream of the SID visa.
Income thresholds. What's that all about?
Well, it's about attracting higher earning professionals, addressing those concerns about wage suppression that have been around for a while.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about filling skills gaps. It's also about making sure those skills are well compensated.
Exactly. It's about attracting people who can contribute to the economy in a meaningful way.
And hopefully those higher salaries will mean they're less likely to, be exploited or have to jump through hoops to stay in the country.
That's the idea, at least.
So is this SID visa like a golden ticket to a new life down under? Does everyone who applies get in?
I wish it were that easy. It's still competitive, You've got to meet the criteria, score enough points, and the demand for different skills changes all the time, so what's hot today might not be tomorrow.
Oh, so it's not just about having the right skills, it's about having them at the right time. Talk about pressure.
Right. Timing is everything. But speaking of things that can make or break your chances, the article also mentioned something new, visa ballots.
Wait, visa ballots? Like winning the lottery to get a visa?
It's not quite like winning the lottery, but it's getting close. They've introduced a ballot process for some visa categories where there are way more applicants than available spots.
Wow, that's a big change. So how does that work? Do you just throw your name in a hat and hope for the best?
Pretty much. It's like a random selection process. They do it for the Working Holidaymaker program now, for example.
Oh, right. That one's super popular.
Yeah, tons of young people want to come to Australia, travel, work a bit. So the ballot system is a way to manage the huge demand and make it fairer, at least in theory.
I guess so. But still, it's a big gamble, right?
Yeah.
You could have all the right qualifications, but if your name doesn't get pulled out, that's it.
Exactly. It's a bit of a lottery, literally. But hey, it's also kind of exciting, don't you think? Adds a bit of unpredictability to the whole process.
You're right. It does add a little drama. Okay, so we've got this move away from permanent temporariness, a new points-based system for skilled visas, and now this lottery element thrown into the mix. It's a whole new world out there for people wanting to migrate to Australia.
It definitely is. And we haven't even touched on the potential impact of the upcoming election.
Oh, right. That's the elephant in the room. With the opposition leader promising to cut migration, things could get even more interesting.
Totally. And with all these changes happening, it's hard to say what the future holds for migration to Australia.
But one thing's for sure, it's going to be fascinating to watch it all unfold.
Absolutely. And we'll be here to break it all down for you.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the potential political shakeup, let's take a step back and look at the overall migration picture. The article had some interesting data on actual migration levels in Australia.
Yeah, they did. Those figures are always fascinating. Gives us a real snapshot of what's happening on the ground.
Right. Like, beyond all the policy changes and political rhetoric, what's actually going on?
Exactly. Numbers don't lie.
So what's the story? What do the numbers tell us about migration to Australia right now?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, to be honest, especially with the whole pandemic thing.
Oh, yeah, that definitely threw a wrench in the works.
Big time. Australia pretty much shut its borders back in 2020 during the peak of the pandemic.
Right. Remember those days? It felt like the whole world was on pause.
It did. And of course, that meant migration numbers plummeted. But then when the borders reopened in 2021, there was this massive surge in arrivals.
Makes sense. Everyone who'd been waiting in the wings finally got their chance.
Exactly. It was like pent-up demand, you
Yeah.
know? People had been dreaming of coming to Australia for years, and suddenly the doors were open again.
So after that initial surge, did things settle back down to, I don't know, pre-pandemic levels?
Not quite. Well, the initial rush did level out. Migration levels have remained higher than they were before the pandemic.
Really?
Yeah.
Higher even after that initial catch-up. Interesting.
Yeah. The article highlighted that annual net overseas migration, which is basically the difference between people arriving and leaving Australia, actually peaked in 2022-23.
Wow, so even after the borders had been open for a while, more people were still choosing to make Australia home.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mean, the world went through a lot during those pandemic years, and Australia had some pretty strict border controls.
Yeah, for sure. But it seems like none of that really dented Australia's appeal in the long run.
Nope. People still see it as a desirable place to live, work, and study. The quality of life, the economic opportunities, the stable political environment, those things still hold a lot of weight.
It's like Australia's got that special something that keeps people coming back for more.
Totally. But that's not to say it's all been smooth sailing. The article did mention a drop in net overseas migration in 2023-24.
Right. So what happened there? Did people suddenly decide Australia wasn't so great after all?
I doubt it. There are probably a few things at play. For one, the global economy has been a bit shaky lately, which always makes people hesitant to make big moves.
Yeah, when things are uncertain, people tend to, stay put.
Exactly. And then there are the visa changes we talked about earlier. Those have probably had some impact on migration patterns as well.
Right. Those were pretty significant changes. It would make sense that they'd take some time to, filter through the system.
Yeah, definitely. So with all that going on, what's the prediction for migration levels in the next few years?
Yeah, what's the crystal ball saying?
Well, the government's latest projections, which they released in their mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, suggest that net overseas migration will be around 340,000 in 2024-25.
Okay, so still pretty high.
Yeah, but then they're predicting it'll drop to 255,000 in 2025-26.
So a gradual decrease, but still a significant number of people coming to Australia.
Exactly. It's not like they're shutting the door on migration, but they are definitely trying to manage it more closely.
Trying to strike that balance, right? Attracting the skills and talent that Australia needs without, overwhelming things.
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act for sure. And that brings us back to, well, the elephant in the room, the upcoming election.
Oh, yeah. Can't escape that. The article mentioned that migration is likely to be a big issue during the campaign, right?
For sure. And with the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, pledging to cut migration if his party wins, things could get really heated.
He's been pretty vocal about it, hasn't he?
He has. His argument is that cutting migration would help with things like, housing affordability, reducing pressure on infrastructure. He's even suggested it could help address concerns about wage stagnation.
That's a lot to promise. But I imagine there would be some downsides to cutting migration too, right? It's not quite as simple as less migration, problem solved.
You're telling me. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts. And one of the big concerns is that cutting migration too drastically could actually backfire and lead to labor shortages.
Right, like in those key sectors we were talking about before.
Exactly. Australia relies heavily on skilled migrants to fill critical roles in areas like healthcare, technology, engineering. If the flow of skilled migrants dries up, those sectors could struggle.
And that would have a knock-on effect on the whole economy, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And it's not just about the immediate impact either. Cutting migration could have long-term consequences for Australia's demographics.
Right, like an aging population, shrinking workforce, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a big gamble and not one to be taken lightly. And, it's important to remember that migration isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right, it's about people.
People with lives, with families, with hopes and dreams. People who contribute to the richness and diversity of Australian society. It's easy to forget that in all the political back and forth.
Totally. It's a human story, not just an economic one.
Exactly. And that human element is something we need to keep in mind as we, navigate these complex issues.
Well said. So we've got this political debate raging on, the economy throwing curveballs, and a whole new set of rules for how migration works. It's a lot to take in.
It's definitely a lot. But hey, that's what makes it so fascinating.
You're right. It's never boring. And speaking of things that keep us on our toes, let's circle back to that whole visa ballot thing.
Oh, yeah, the lottery. It's definitely a new frontier for Australian migration.
Totally. It's not something you usually associate with, a country like Australia. It feels more like, a desperate scramble for a golden ticket.
Oh, wait. I know what you mean. It definitely raises some big questions about fairness and, well, whether luck should play such a big role in deciding who gets to come to Australia.
Exactly. Like, on the one hand, I can see how a lottery system could be appealing. It seems straightforward, right?
It does. When you've got way more applicants than spots available, a lottery can seem like the fairest way to manage that demand. Like, okay, everyone's got an equal chance. Let's just draw names out of a hat.
Right. No bias, no favoritism, just pure chance.
Exactly. And in some ways, that does feel fair, especially when you've got, thousands of people all vying for a handful of visas.
Right. It takes the subjectivity out of the equation.
Yeah. But then again, is it really fair to base such a life-changing decision on pure luck?
That's the big question. What about those people who might be incredibly qualified, who have exactly the skills Australia needs, but they just happen to have bad luck in the draw?
That's the dilemma. You're sacrificing a certain level of control for the sake of randomness. And you might end up with people who are less qualified or less experienced getting a visa simply because their number came up.
It's almost like taking a step back in time, relying on chance rather than, a merit-based system. I wonder if there are other unintended consequences of this lottery approach too. Like, does it change how people approach the application process?
I think it definitely does. One concern is that it might encourage people to apply multiple times, even if they don't really meet the criteria,
Right.
just to increase their odds of being selected.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Just flood the system with applications and hope one gets through.
Exactly. And that could create a whole new set of problems, bogging down the system even more.
Right. So it's not as simple as it might seem on the surface.
Definitely not. And then there's the question of whether it actually levels the playing field, Not everyone has equal access to information or resources, even when it comes to something like a lottery.
Right, like some people might be more tech savvy, more comfortable navigating online systems, or they might be able to afford to hire a migration agent.
Exactly. So even though it's a lottery, it's not necessarily a level playing field.
So it's still a work in progress then. I guess Australia is kind of experimenting with this approach, seeing how it works in practice.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the long run and if other countries follow suit.
It's almost like watching a social experiment unfold in real time. Okay, so we've talked about the shift away from permanent temporariness, all the new visa changes, the impact of the pandemic, the upcoming election, and now this visa lottery element. Phew. It's a lot to keep track of.
It really is. But I think it highlights just how complex and, frankly, how dynamic the whole migration landscape is. There are so many factors at play.
Totally. And it's not just about, numbers and policies. It's about real people making big decisions about their lives. And those decisions have ripple effects across the whole of Australian society.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the nitty-gritty details, but ultimately it's about people.
People from all over the world choosing to call Australia home. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is, and it's something to celebrate. It is. And it makes you realize that the decisions made by policymakers, they have real consequences for people's lives.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that sometimes.
Right. We get caught up in the statistics, the policy debates, but at the end of the day, it's about real people making life-changing decisions.
Totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Australian migration, what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with?
That's a good question. I guess, first and foremost, I hope they'll appreciate the complexity of this issue. It's not just black and white. There are so many different perspectives, so many factors to consider.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that today.
Right. And it's not just about numbers. It's about people's lives, their aspirations, their contributions to Australian society.
Absolutely. And those contributions are valuable, regardless of, where someone comes from or how old they are.
Exactly. And I think it's important for people to understand that the decisions made by policymakers, they have real-world consequences.
Yeah, for individuals, for families, for the whole country, really.
Right. And as we head towards this election, I think it's crucial for voters to be informed about the different perspectives on migration and the potential impact of these proposed policies.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Me too. It's clear that Australia is at this pivotal moment, grappling with some big questions about its future, about what kind of country it wants to be.
Yeah, and migration is a huge part of that conversation.
It really is. And with an election just around the corner, the stakes are pretty high.
They are. So to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has shed some light on, the complexities of Australia's evolving migration landscape.
We've only just scratched the surface, really.
Right. There's always more to learn, more to explore.
Exactly. So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Because the future of Australian migration, well, it's in all of our hands. And until next time, happy exploring.